A foggy night descended upon the mountainous serpentine roads like a thick blanket, obscuring the starry sky. A young couple, Emily and Jake, embarked on a romantic trip, hoping to savor solitude in the beauty of the mountainous terrain. Their car glided through the darkness, illuminated only by the headlights. However, with every kilometer, the road became more terrifying. The serpentine twists seemed to loop around endless fog, and Emily felt shivers running down her spine. "Jake, this was a bad idea. We should have stayed in this city," she whispered, peering into the impenetrable darkness outside the window. Jake shrugged. "Emily, this is an adventure. Isn't this what we travel for, moments like these?" But even his confidence began to wane as they reached a remote area with no signs of life. The city lights had long faded away, and now they were surrounded by an atmosphere of unreality. They continued driving until they encountered a thick layer of fog that slowly enveloped their car, creating a sensation of floating in an ominous darkness. "Jake, let us turn on the smartphone's navigation. Maybe it can help us find a way out," Emily said, her voice filled with anxiety. Jake took out his smartphone and attempted to activate the navigation. However, the screen remained dark, and he repeatedly pressed the buttons without any response. "No signal, Emily. There is no network or connection here," he said, feeling fear creeping in. They pulled over, trying to make out anything in the impenetrable mist. Twilight majestically descended, and the landscape appeared desolate and boundless. "Jake, what should we do?" Emily was afraid to turn and look into the darkness outside the window. She felt that something was watching them. Jake gripped the steering wheel and said firmly, "We'll keep moving forward to the nearest town. It is our only option." They set off again, but as they progressed along the empty roads, their fear intensified. They began to hear strange sounds, rustling in the darkness, the swish of leaves, and distant wolf howls. Each sound filled them with unease. And then, at a turn, they saw something strange. A car, wrecked and overturned, stood in the middle of the road. It looked as though it had been abandoned for many years. "Jake, what is this place?" Emily asked, but received no answer. Instead, Jake slowed down to maneuver around the wreckage. They continued on, but soon discovered another abandoned car on the road, and another one, all covered in dust and dirt, as if they had been here for decades. Jake and Emily stopped and got out of their car to get a closer look. They were stunned. These cars had been here for a very long time, untouched and forsaken. "What the hell happened here?" Jake exclaimed, gazing at the endless row of abandoned vehicles disappearing into the darkness. And then, seemingly from nowhere, they heard whispers, faint and hoarse, like the voices of lost souls. "Help! Help! Help!" Jake and Emily turned around but saw no one. The whispers seemed to have been summoned from the darkness. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, barely holding back tears. But when they returned to their car, they found that it no longer started. The engine remained silent, and Jake's attempts to start it yielded no results. "We ray stuck here," Jake said, trembling with fear. At that moment, the fog thickened and darkened. They began to discern ghostly figures rising above the abandoned cars. These were the souls of the deceased, bound to this place by a tragic accident. "Help! Don't leave us," the ghosts whispered, drawing closer to Emily and Jake. The couple screamed and tried to flee, but their legs refused to move. The ghosts surrounded them, and fear overwhelmed them like no other scenario they had ever imagined. And then, as if from a distance, a loud siren sounded. In the distance, headlights appeared, and another car approached the site of the horrifying accident. Emily and Jake realized that this was their last chance for salvation. The siren grew louder, the headlights shone brighter, and the ghosts began to vanish into the darkness. Emily and Jake, still feeling the grip of fear, rushed toward the approaching car. The car's door opened, and a man in a police uniform stepped out. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at the frightened young couple. We got stuck here," Emily muttered, hardly believing her eyes. The police officer helped them into his car and drove them to the nearest town. They soon learned that the place they had found themselves in was the scene of a terrible accident many years ago. Numerous people had lost their lives in that tragedy, and their souls continued to wander this area, craving new victims. Emily and Jake would never forget the horror of that night, but they felt fortunate to have escaped that place alive. Since then, they never dared to embark on a journey into the darkness again. Through the truck's windshield, piercing the darkness of the night, Henry could see only one thing, the flickering headlights in the distance. He was alone, taking on the night shift on this long route through the desert, and now his task was to endure the long hours before morning awakened this world. But the longer he traveled down this road, the stranger and lonelier the night felt. The road was undoubtedly long. Henry had lost track of the kilometers. He should have reached the next town long ago, but he was still moving through the lifeless desert. Nothing had changed, just endless sand dunes stretching in all directions. Overwhelmed by a sense of infinity, Henry decided to switch on the radio. Music should help keep him alert, but as he pressed the button, a distorted melody slowly emerged, as if a signal from another world. Henry tried to change the stations, but the same thing played everywhere. This song, or whatever it was, grew louder and louder, penetrating the deepest corners of Henry's mind. After several hours of agonizing journey, Henry decided it was time to stop and take a nap. He slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, but when he woke up a few minutes later, he saw that his truck was still moving down the road. He couldn't remember making any adjustments to the controls. Even the engine was running as if nothing had happened. For some inexplicable reason, he couldn't stop. Panic began to rise within him. Henry pressed the brakes, but they didn't respond. He twisted the steering wheel, but it was in vain. The truck continued to move forward, paying no attention to his efforts. Overwhelmed by fear, Henry tried to veer off the road, but the road itself seemed to defy the laws of physics. After several attempts, he suddenly realized he was back on the same road as before. His attempts to deviate from it led to nowhere. Time and space became distorted and infinite. The night seemed to last an eternity, and the truck moved as if trapped in a nightmare. Henry felt like he was losing control of reality. He tried everything within his power. He screamed, pounded the steering wheel, and even attempted to leave the truck, but each time he found himself back on the same road, with the same grim landscape outside the window. Hours turned into days, and days into weeks. Henry began to console himself, thinking that it was all just a dream, but the nightmare continued without end. Through the windows, he saw ghostly figures flickering in the distance, like specters, and he couldn't tell if they were part of his hallucinations or real. He began to hear whispers, voices coming from nowhere, addressing him. Henry tried to ignore them, but they grew louder and louder, invading his consciousness. It was as if the voices were the very essence of the boundless desert that seemed to come to life. Henry lost track of time. He couldn't remember how long it had been since he embarked on this night journey. He felt like he was no longer human, but a part of this endless road. He couldn't remember what he looked like, who he was. His consciousness was consumed by this dark magic. And suddenly, just when he felt he could no longer bear this nightmare, the road in front of him disappeared. Henry found himself in complete darkness. He stepped out of the truck and stood in the night, unable to see anything around him. It was then that he realized he had arrived in nowhere, a world of darkness and madness, where the road led only to endless darkness. He could no longer return. He had lost himself in this boundless night, and now he was a part of it, forever wandering in the darkness of the road to nowhere. On one of the dark and desolate roads deep in the heart of the American South stood a solitary gas station. The night was ominous, and the moon barely illuminated this remote corner of the land. A dim light burned at the gas station, beckoning travelers from the darkness. Emily worked at this gas station, a young woman with sorrowful eyes burdened by a heavy life. She was lonely, and her life was far from a fairy tale. She dreamed of leaving this bleak place, but day after day, she continued to fall asleep at the lonely gas station, watching strangers' lives pass her by. One night, when the darkness was particularly profound and the gas station sat empty, a knock echoed at the door. Emily looked up, fear in her eyes, and saw two young men standing at the entrance. "We ray lost, the road ended, and we ray almost out of gas," said one of the young men, his eyes filled with worry. Emily smiled and allowed them to come inside. She knew what it was like to be lost in the night. She filled their tank and began chatting with the young men, getting to know them better. As it turned out, they were students returning from a mountain hiking trip. They shared their adventures with Emily, laughing at their foolish mistakes. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt alive and joyful. She offered them a cup of hot coffee, and they accepted. Time flew by, and they left and talked until the outside world began to lighten with dawn. The young men approached the counter to pay for the gas and coffee, but Emily refused to take their money. "Just be careful on the road," she said, smiling. The young men thanked her and left, leaving Emily standing at the gas station as threshold, watching them go. She felt that something had changed that night. She no longer felt alone and helpless. She felt lighter. However, as soon as she returned inside and sat back behind the counter, her joy turned into horror. Outside the window, she saw the young man whose car was parked in the dimly lit area, seemingly anchored in place. She rushed to the door and hurried outside. The young men were in a state of panic, pointing to the road. Emily approached and realized that the road had vanished, as if swallowing their car. They were on the edge of a cliff. Horror overcame Emily, and she rushed to help them out of this situation. But it was already too late. The car began to slide towards the abyss, and she heard the terrified screams of the young man, but she couldn't do anything. In a moment, the car disappeared into the darkness, and at the spot where it had stood just moments ago, there was silence. Emily stood at the edge of the cliff, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe what had just happened. It was like a nightmare. She called the police, and after a few hours, rescuers arrived at the scene. They searched for the car and the young man, but found nothing. The abyss seemed to have swallowed everything, as if nothing had ever happened. Emily told the police about how the young men had come to her gas station and how she had offered them help. The police listened, but they had no explanation for what had occurred. Since then, nighttime driving on the dark roads of the American South became even more perilous and mysterious. People say that sometimes in the night, you can see young men vanishing into the darkness, just like that car. Emily could no longer work at the gas station. She moved to another town, trying to forget that dreadful night. But in her dreams, those young men still sometimes appeared, pleading for help, and she would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to forget the night when the dark road claimed their lives.